Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are tackling a case study in cybersecurity failure that is, well, genuinely alarming. It really undermines the very foundation of digital trust we rely on.
It really does. We often tell people, check the domain name, make sure the sender is legitimate. But what happens when the sender's domain is 100% legitimate, verified, belongs to a huge national institution?
Yeah, that's the scary part.
That's the terrifying paradox we're diving into today. The title says it all. The valid domain is a weapon. Deep dive into the four-organization phishing case.
It's a chilling thought, isn't it? We're looking at an ongoing, pretty high-profile cybersecurity incident out of Thailand. And the level of compromise is just, well, frightening. The institutions involved are big ones, central to the country's infrastructure. We're talking a market regulator, major financial institution, a national carrier, and other key financial players, too.
And the sheer scope makes this so critical. The attackers managed to use the actual verified email systems of these major players. They launched a massive phishing campaign, sending out over 100,000 fraudulent emails. Think about that. Communicating directly from a source people are trained to trust.
That initial shock factor must have been huge. The usual red flags for scams, misspelled domains, weird characters, they just weren't there. So if you get an email that looks like it's from, say, investments at majorfinancialinstitution.sco.th, well, your guard is down, isn't it? The message suddenly seems incredibly credible.
Oh, absolutely. And they weaponized that credibility perfectly. These weren't just random spam emails. They were crafted, often dangling attractive offers, like investing in crypto or digital assets. And then the hook, click this link, enter your personal details. Classic identity theft and financial fraud, but wrapped in the most official-looking package imaginable.
Right. So this demands a proper forensic look. If the actual domain was used, the attackers must have compromised the specific system authorized to send emails from that domain. That immediately points away from hacking the main servers, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It leads us to phase one, finding that initial weak link.
Exactly. And the forensic findings here are pretty clear. The attackers did not get into the organization's core servers. Customer databases, critical financial systems, those were reportedly secure, intact.
Okay, so the crown jewels were safe, you could say, but the official delivery truck, the email system, was essentially hijacked. Where was the way in?
The entry point was an account on their third-party email service provider platform. You can think of it like an outsourced digital mailroom. Big organizations use these vendors all the time.
Why is that? Why not use their own servers?
Well, their own internal servers often aren't built to handle sending, say, 100,000 marketing emails at once. They'd get flagged as spam instantly by global filters. So these third-party platforms manage the high volume, the deliverability, subscription lists, all that stuff.
That makes sense from a business perspective, yeah. Sending mass emails is tricky. But wow, that introduces a massive security consideration, doesn't it? You're essentially letting a third party speak officially for you.
Precisely. And the security of that authority boils down to just a set of valid access credentials, a username and a password. These credentials belong to an employee or maybe a functional unit within those four organizations, someone who had the right permissions on the vendor's platform. This is our Factor 1 access point.
Okay, let's dig into that. How did they get those initial credentials? Factor 1. This immediately brings up the kind of user account that was likely hit. When you analyze breaches like this, what's the typical profile of the exploited user?
Well, the evidence strongly suggests a pretty significant failure in how accounts were managed. It's highly probable the exploited account was either a shared user account or, and this is often the case, a functional account. Addresses like campaigns@domain.com or maybe investor updates@domain.com.
Right. Why are those shared or functional accounts such a big risk? Especially for major institutions that you'd think would be super careful.
It really comes down to accountability and how policies get enforced. If an individual employee has their own account, security policies are usually pretty strict, right? Complex passwords, regular changes, maybe even hardware tokens for MFA. But if 5 people share the password for the marketing or campaigns account, well, that crucial layer of individual ownership just evaporates.
And that lack of ownership probably leads straight to sloppy password habits, I'd guess.
Exactly that. People tend to choose simpler, easier to remember passwords. Plus, IT departments sometimes treat these functional accounts differently. Maybe less frequent mandatory password changes, or they might overlook needing advanced 2FA, thinking of them as just utility accounts, not critical access points. That makes them prime targets.
Okay, so the attackers needed the username and the password. Let's start with the username. How would they figure out the correct username for logging into this third-party platform?
Often, they don't need a super sophisticated hack for the username itself, especially if it's just the email address. First method is simple enumeration. For lots of functional accounts like security updates at SIM or media relations at the Abertintischen, the address might be listed publicly on the organization's website. Or if the company uses a predictable naming style for staff, maybe first initial, last name, an attacker can guess the format easily. They just gather these public emails and try them as logins.
So half the key is potentially just out there in the open.
Potentially, yes. The second route, and this is more dangerous given the scale here, is using data from prior data leaks to prepare for credential stuffing. Attackers have enormous databases, billions of username password pairs collected from unrelated breaches over years. Think old forums, retail sites, smaller company hacks. They can cross-reference known employee emails from these big tie institutions against their stash of leaked credentials.
Ah, okay. That makes the next step actually getting the password, factor one, much less about luck then.
Much less. Now, the investigation reports mentioned brute force attempts at this factor one stage, but we need to be careful about what that means in this context. If an attacker tried a direct, blind brute force, just guessing millions of random combinations against, say, a decent 12-character
They
password.
hit a wall pretty fast, right? The system's basic defense, max try limit.
Exactly. The account should lock after maybe 5 wrong tries. That stops automated guessing dead in its tracks.
So a pure brute force on the password itself seems unlikely for these kinds of organizations.
It's much less likely to succeed without tripping alarms. That's why the credential stuffing hypothesis is far more plausible for getting that initial login. The attackers weren't guessing randomly. They were using passwords already leaked from other websites. Passwords that the employee or whoever set up that functional account unfortunately reused.
Right. So instead of trying a million wrong passwords and getting locked out, they try maybe 5 passwords they know were linked to that email address previously.
Right.
If one matches, boom, they're in on the first or second try. The system never sees a suspicious pattern of failures.
Precisely. They exploit human error password reuse and poor security hygiene, not raw computing power against a strong password. And this is why those functional accounts are such a risk. If the person who set up campaigns at one used, I don't know, Thailand 2023 as the password, and they also used Thailand 2023 on some random forum that got breached 2 years ago, well, that username password pair is sitting in a criminal database ready to be stuffed into this high-value target.
That's a really important distinction. The failure wasn't necessarily about password complexity itself, but about the policies around password uniqueness and reuse.
It points directly to weak internal policy enforcement, especially for shared credentials that control access to, well, pretty critical external systems like this email platform.
And the forensic trail backed this up, didn't it? Showing it was a coordinated attack.
Yes, absolutely. The initial login attempts that eventually succeeded were tracked coming from 4 distinct international IP addresses. This confirms it wasn't just one person. It was a coordinated effort, probably using automated tools spread across different countries. Attackers often use that geographic spread to try and bypass basic IP-based blocking or rate limiting that might exist, even on the Factor 1 login screen.
Okay, so that wraps up phase 1. The attackers got valid Factor 1 credentials, likely via credential stuffing using coordinated access points. But here's where it gets really, truly alarming. Because they still faced what should have been the main hurdle, two-factor authentication.
This takes us straight into phase 2, and what the investigation found is really the forensic smoking gun here. 2FA is supposed to be the safety net, right? Even if your password gets stolen, the attacker still needs something else, usually your phone, an app, a token, to generate that one-time password, the OTP.
But they got past it. They gained full access to send emails as the organizations. The investigation pinpointed one single disastrous technical flaw in the third-party vendor system.
That's right. The core technical vulnerability, the linchpin of the whole attack, was a failure in how the system handled the OTP input itself. Specifically, the OTP input screen lacked effective rate limiting.
Okay, let's spend some real time on this because this feels like the central lesson from the whole incident. Can you define rate limiting clearly and explain why it's so vital for protecting 2FA?
Sure. Rate limiting is, well, it's a fundamental security control. Think of it like a digital speed bump or a traffic cop. Its job is simply to prevent abuse by putting a cap, a limit, on how many times someone can make a specific request or attempt within a certain time frame.
Like trying your PIN at an ATM, maybe. You get 3 tries and the machine eats your card.
That's a perfect analogy. Applied to an OTP screen, effective rate limiting would say something like, okay, you can only try entering 3 different 6-digit codes in the next 60 seconds. If you go faster than that, the system should react. It should either lock the account temporarily or maybe introduce a long delay between attempts, making automated guessing practically impossible.
And the investigation confirmed that this third-party email provider system just didn't have that. No effective rate limiting on the screen where you type in the OTP.
That's the damning finding. That absence, that lack of a basic control, allowed the attackers to just unleash an automated brute force tool. They could just hammer that input field with guessed 6-digit codes continuously, rapidly, without triggering any lockout, any denial, any alert. Nothing stopped them.
It's kind of mind-boggling that the complexity of the attack didn't matter here. It was a purely architectural failure. Let's check numbers for a second, because that really highlights the disaster.
Yeah.
What factors combine to make this lack of rate limiting so catastrophic?
Well, first, look at the target itself, the OTP format. It was only 6 digits. That means there are exactly 1 million possible combinations, right?
Oh.
0000000 up to 9999999.
A million sounds like a lot to a person, but for automated tools today,
Yeah.
that's really a challenge, is it?
Not even close, especially if there's no defense mechanism like rate limiting. Let's just run some quick math. Imagine a modern attack tool trying to guess the code. Let's be conservative and say it can make just 10 attempts per second via API calls over a decent internet connection.
Okay, 10 guesses a second.
That's 600 attempts per minute.
Right, 600 per minute. So if you take the 1 million total combinations and divide by 600 guesses per minute.
You find they could theoretically try every single one of the million combinations in just under 28 hours. And remember, that's assuming just one attacker, one IP address working alone. But the forensics confirmed they used 4 distinct international IPs simultaneously.
So 4 attackers working together divides the workload. They each only need to check 250,000 codes. That brings the maximum time needed down to, what, under 7 hours?
Potentially, yes, which is an incredibly short time. And crucially, they don't usually need to try all million codes. They just need to hit the correct one. They might stumble upon it in minutes, maybe an hour. The fact that the system allowed this continuous high-speed guessing against a simple 6-digit code, it basically turns 2FA from a strong shield into, well, just a minor speed bump. It didn't really function as security.
And wasn't there another problem compounding this? Something about how long the OTP codes were actually valid for?
Yes. This is where the vendor's design choices look particularly bad. The industry standard for time-based one-time passwords, TOTP, the ones that change frequently, it's usually 30 seconds, maybe 60 seconds. This short lifespan forces an attacker to guess very quickly. But some reports indicated the OTP codes on the system had a much longer validation period, perhaps as long as 24 hours.
24 hours.
Yeah.
For a one-time password, that seems fundamentally wrong from a security standpoint.
It completely undermines the time-sensitive aspect of the authentication. If the code is good for 24 hours, the attacker has this huge relaxed window to work in. It's far longer than the 7 hours or so they might need to guarantee cracking it. It turns the whole thing into a static puzzle they can solve at their leisure. It's like the system is saying, no rush, take your time. The code will still be good tomorrow morning.
Okay, let me push back slightly on the timeline. Thinking about factor 1 again. We reasoned that credential stuffing was likely for the password breach, factor 1. But if this vendor, serving these major institutions, was careless enough to have no rate limiting on factor 2, the OTP, is it possible they also lacked strong max try limits on the factor 1 password screen itself?
That's a really sharp question, and it gets to the heart of vendor security auditing, doesn't it? It points to potentially a much deeper systemic failure. If a vendor was negligent enough to skip rate limiting on the OTP screen, which is Security 101, then yes, it's highly probable they might also have had weak or maybe even non-existent max try limits or IP blocking on the initial password entry screen.
Okay, and if that was the case, couldn't it mean the factor 1 password was potentially breached by just a pure blind brute force attack, rather than needing a reused password?
It doesn't rule out credential stuffing, but it certainly opens the door to brute force being an option too. Even if the system lacked max try limits on factor 1, sophisticated attackers often still prefer credential stuffing. Why? Because brute forcing even a moderately strong random password is still noisy and takes computational effort. Finding a reused password via stuffing can be almost instant, much quieter, and more efficient. The fact that they got through factor 1 relatively quickly to then exploit the lack of rate limiting on factor 2 still suggests factor 1 was compromised easily, probably because the password was weak or more likely reused.
Got it. So regardless of the exact method for factor one, the critical takeaway is clear. The failure of that final defense layer, the OTP rate limiting, is the technical smoking gun. A layer of security that we all rely on, rendered completely useless by a basic design mistake by the vendor.
Absolutely. The attack didn't succeed because of some super advanced zero-day exploit against the main financial systems. It succeeded because of a failure in fundamental security hygiene rate limiting on an outsourced component, a classic supply chain vulnerability.
Okay, moving into part four then. Let's
Mhm.
talk about the impact, the real cost of this failure. The criminals controlled the email domains, sent 100,000 emails, but what data actually fell into their hands? Let's separate the institutional data from the victim data.
Right. There are two main categories of data compromised here. First, and most directly, the access credentials themselves, the username and password used to log into that third-party email service provider account. Those were stolen and used. That set of credentials is now out there. And if the employees who use that account reuse that same password for any other internal systems, which, given our factor one discussion, seems plausible,
Then those other systems are immediately at risk too. Wow.
it constitutes a serious breach of the organization's internal access control, even if the main customer or financial data wasn't touched directly by this specific attack vector.
Okay, that's the institutional side. What about the public?
That's where the immediate harm occurred. While 100,000 emails went out, reports suggested around 3,000 people actually clicked the phishing link and potentially entered their details on the fake website. So the criminals directly stole the personal identifiable information, PII, from those thousands of victims.
And what kind of PII are we talking about in a fake crypto investment scam like this?
Typically, at a minimum, things like name, phone number, email address, that's enough for more targeted spear phishing later or other identity theft attempts. But often, these scam sites go further. They might ask for login details for other financial services or even ask victims to upload copies of ID documents, supposedly to verify your investment account. That kind of data is incredibly valuable for follow-up financial fraud.
And a breach like this, involving major national institutions in Thailand, it must trigger some pretty strict legal obligations, right? These organizations aren't just dealing with bad PR, they have mandatory reporting and investigation duties under Thai law.
That's exactly right. Because of their critical nature, they actually fall under a dual reporting requirement. First, there's the data protection law, Thailand's PDPA, which works a lot like Europe's GDPR.
And what does that law demand immediately after discovering a breach?
The main thing is speed. The organization, as the data controller, has to report the breach to the regulator, the PDPC, within a very tight 72-hour window from discovery. That short deadline is designed to force a rapid response and reduce the chance of evidence being lost or covered up. They also have to notify the affected individuals directly if the breach poses a high risk to them, which, given that PII and financial scamming potential was involved here, it clearly does.
Okay, that's the data protection side.
Yeah,
And the second legal layer comes from their status as critical infrastructure.
precisely. Since the market regulator, the major financial institution, and the national carrier are all designated as critical information infrastructure, CII, they have another, arguably stricter, duty under Thailand's cybersecurity law.
How does the cybersecurity law differ in its requirements here?
It's focused less on individual privacy and more on the overall security and stability of the nation's critical systems. Under the CII regulations, these organizations must report the incident to the National Cyber Agency, the NCSA, essentially without delay, immediately. This report is vital because it kicks off a national-level incident response coordination effort.
And this dual legal pressure forces them into action, right? Mandatory incident response, mandatory forensic analysis, which is how we know these technical details we're discussing.
Yes, the law compels them. They have to activate their incident response plan. But crucially, they must conduct a formal forensic investigation. The goal is to figure out exactly how the attack happened, contain the damage, and very importantly, preserve all the digital evidence. Things like silver logs, IP addresses, transaction records. This is needed for potential legal action later. The detailed analysis that uncovered the rate-limiting flaw, that was a direct result of these legal requirements ensuring accountability and technical transparency.
Okay, let's pivot now to the lessons learned, the takeaways. So what does this whole deep dive really mean for other organizations out there, especially those using third-party services? What's the key WP forensics lesson here?
Well, the number one takeaway has to be about third-party vendor risk assessment. It needs a fundamental rethink. It just can't be a tick box exercise anymore. The critical realization is that any external vendor who holds valid credentials or domain authority for you, even if it's for something seemingly non-critical like email marketing, becomes a potential gateway, a primary attack vector into your organization.
They effectively become part of your security perimeter, whether you treat them that way or not. Like, if your main systems are a fortress, the third-party email platform is like having a trusted contractor with keys to the side gate if their keys get stolen.
That's a great analogy. The attackers can just walk right in using the trusted contractor's keys. Organizations absolutely must start treating vendor access credentials with the same level of scrutiny they apply to their own internal admin accounts. That means things like mandatory vulnerability scanning of the vendor's platform, writing explicit security requirements into contracts like demanding proof of independent audits of their 2FA system.
Okay, so scrutinize your vendors much more closely. What's the second big takeaway, the technical one linked to the smoking gun?
That has to be the absolute non-negotiable requirement for strong, properly rate-limited 2FA implementation on all critical access points, both internal and external.
Let's reinforce what strong means in this context.
It's basic security hygiene, but it clearly needs repeating. A 6-digit OTP without rate limiting is, functionally, not much better than a public password. It's just a feature, not real security. Strong controls must include, first, aggressive account lockouts after just a few failed OTP attempts. Not hundreds, not thousands. A few. Second, you need IP-based rate limiting as well, to stop automated tools from just spraying guesses from multiple locations. And third, a very short OTP expiry window, ideally 30 to 60 seconds, like the standard TOTP apps use. That dramatically shrinks the window for any brute force attempt.
It really feels like the core failure here wasn't just a technical glitch, but a failure of, well, basic due diligence by the vendor. They missed a fundamental security control that's been standard practice for probably over a decade.
It was a failure of architectural fundamentals, yes. When you're building systems handling this kind of sensitive access for major institutions, security has to be built in, defense in depth. But in this case, that crucial final layer of defense was basically non-existent. It was tissue paper.
And this brings us back to those user accounts again, the functional ones. The idea that campaigns at A might have been the weak link because it had looser security rules than, say, an executive's account. That highlights a huge blind spot in internal IT policy, doesn't it?
It really does. For any account that requires shared access to these functional accounts, organizations should seriously consider moving away from shared passwords altogether. Instead, maybe use mandatory individual application keys or unique tokens tied to each person who needs access. So if 5 people need access to the email platform, you issue 5 distinct, non-reusable tokens or keys. That way, if there is a compromise, you can track exactly which user's access was misused. It brings back that individual accountability that's totally lost with a shared password.
Okay, so let's try and synthesize this whole forensic journey. The attack on these 4 major Thai institutions wasn't some super sophisticated, stealthy hack of their core databases. It was more like an automated digital locksmith, targeting the weakest point in their supply chain, this third-party email provider. They likely exploited a reused password to get Factor 1 access, and then they exploited a really basic, almost embarrassing error in the vendor's Factor 2 protection, the missing rate limit, to get full control of the email domain.
That's the essence of it, yes. The failure was ultimately preventable. The execution of the OTP brute force was technical, sure, but the root cause was simple negligence. Negligence in vendor security standards, specifically the failure to implement rate limiting on a simple 6-digit code. The organization's own legitimate domains were turned into weapons because a fundamental security gate was just left wide open by their supplier.
And that reality is, frankly, quite terrifying, because it means the failure stemmed from technical negligence, not from facing some unstoppable technical genius attacker.
Exactly, which means prevention really comes down to enforcing and auditing basic security standards consistently everywhere across your entire digital ecosystem, including your suppliers.
So here's something for you, our listeners, to think about after this deep dive. A provocative thought, perhaps. If one of the most fundamental security controls, rate limiting, failed on a key vendor system used by major national institutions that are legally required to have high cybersecurity standards under things like CII regulations, then what other external tools, what other third-party systems that are used by the organizations you interact with every single day? What other systems might be vulnerable to these same kinds of simple, automated attacks because of similar basic oversights?
It really highlights that your security perimeter isn't just your own network anymore. It extends out to every single service provider you rely on. It demands constant skeptical vigilance across that whole supply chain.
That's a sobering thought, definitely, but a really necessary one. Thank you for walking us through this meticulous forensic breakdown. It's been really insightful.
Always good to connect the technical details back to the real-world impact and the lessons we can learn.
And thank you all for joining us for this deep dive. If you want more in-depth analysis like this cybersecurity incidents, technical breakdowns, the biggest stories happening in the digital security world, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe to WP Forensics. We'll be back soon with another one.